Welcome to episode 161 of the CUInsight Experience. I'm Randy Smith, one of the co-founders of CUInsight.com, and this show is all about taking a deep dive with the leaders of the credit union movement that make it so great. This episode is brought to you by CUIs, the credit union industry's leading talent development solutions provider. After listening to our show, be sure to learn more about TalentNEXT, the conference that takes a laser-focused look at smart people strategies for your CU. Register today at content.cuis.org/talent.talentnext. We'll repeat that again in the show notes for sure. Today, I'm having a conversation with Jill Nowacki. Beyond being my human and my favorite person to have a conversation with on or off the show, Jill is also the founder and CEO of Humanidei. So let's jump right in. Jill, welcome back to the show, my love.
Thanks, Randy.
Let's start with the quick background. If people haven't listened to your previous appearances on this show, where'd your career start and how did that lead you to starting Humanidei now 4 years ago? Impressive.
Yeah, thank you. So my credit union career started about 22 years ago in Montana. I was able to start my kind of first real job out of college doing marketing for Montana's credit unions and had the chance to fall in love with the mission of credit unions and what they could accomplish. And so I had a 20 years of sort of meandering through, or I guess 18 years of kind of meandering through the credit union space with some different careers that moved along, including the last one I had before founding Humanidei was serving as the president CEO at the Credit Union League of Connecticut. And in that role, it just became increasingly clear to me that if credit unions were really going to fulfill our mission, and I believe credit unions are capable of eradicating global poverty if we do, in fact, fulfill our mission correctly, but that we will only do that if we get the people side right. And so I kind of stopped for a minute and thought, hey, I can do something a little different here and help make sure we do get the people side right. And so Humanidei was founded in 2019 in order to help credit unions become more inclusive workplaces to really be able to deliver on our ability to fulfill that mission and change people's lives.
And it has been fun to watch you grow it. So congratulations. This episode came about because we wanted to have a conversation about future-proofing the workplace in credit unions. And we will get to that shortly. But what currently has you excited in credit union land? And on the flip side of that, where are you seeing the struggles?
I'm going to start with the struggles so that I can end on a more positive note with that. So I think right now, we're looking at the broader economy is causing people to be concerned. And I think we've seen Q1 numbers come in and the evidence suggests that credit unions are having some earnings difficulties, that we are starting to see some of the fears we had related to consumer behavior and how that impacts credit union bottom lines. And so the struggles right now, there's some earnings pressure on, and I think that has people feeling a little concerned, maybe a little more pessimistic about the outlook there. So I think that's the current struggle. What I'm excited about, though, is that even with that kind of downturn that we're facing, this feels a lot different to me than some of the other crises I've seen through in my 2 decades with credit unions, where I think there's still, the momentum is still there to move forward. So even with that kind of tougher economic performance, I'm not seeing people slow down a lot of these commitments that they've made to things like creating better workplaces, to things like improving member experiences, to things like committing to their communities. So I'm excited about the momentum that I think is still coming, despite the fact that there are some economic challenges.
Absolutely. What has you excited? That's what you're excited about, is the momentum.
Yeah, I'm excited about the momentum. Yeah.
Awesome. So let's jump into the top of mind topic. For our listeners out there, what does it mean to future-proof the workplace?
So for me, when I'm thinking about future-proofing the workplace, and maybe that's why I'm so tuned into this idea of the momentum that we have here, but what it is looking at what are we trying to be? So not just what are we today or what have we been in the past, but really what is it that we need to be doing in the future? And how do we make sure that we're building for that possibility today? And in the workplace, that specifically looks like making sure we're we're evaluating the positions we have, those boxes we have on the org chart, to check and see if they're really the way that we will be serving our members in the future. And then making sure that we're working to develop the people in order to be able to move there, and giving real consideration to what it is people want when it comes to the workplace. If our relationship with the workplace as employers continues to be based on the way things have always been done, that would be the opposite of future-proofing the workplace. Whereas if instead we can look at the workplace and say, what are some of these trends we're seeing in human behavior right now? And how do we position ourselves to be able to make sure we're a place that people are still going to want to be part of as we move forward?
Let's go down that rabbit hole a little bit more. What are some of the trends that you're seeing right now?
So the biggest trend that I think we've seen really emerge in the last 4 years, and so I'm going to tell a little story, and I promise I'll come back to this, but I've been spending a lot of time in airports lately, and you overhear a lot of conversations, in the gate area and in the lounge or whatever at the airport. And I was coming back from we had just done a CEO interview for a credit union. They had been assessing an internal candidate who's pretty young, and she's incredible, and she's dedicated, and she's loyal, and they're moving forward, and she'll become the CEO of this credit union. So I'm coming off of this interview where it's inspiring and it's motivating, and I'm elevated about the possibilities of the future CEOs of the credit union space. And I'm hearing these two people talk to each other. I think they were not in financial services, a different industry. And they're talking about how terrible employees are today. And this, what's wrong with these people? They call in, or they nobody wants to work anymore. And that kind of sentiment that's there, it makes me really sad, because I think what's really happening, so to go back to answer your question about what is it that the workplace needs to be, is I think that we have humans who have sort of elevated their level of consciousness lately, and they have greater awareness around the life that they want and what they're really looking for out of life. And they've stopped separating these things into buckets to say, well, here's what work is, and this is what it has to be. And here's what home is, and this is what it has to be. And instead they're saying, what is it really that's going to give me this kind of full quality life? And how do I stick to that? And I think as employers, we should be really excited about this possibility to be able to work with people today who are so much more whole than we used to let people be. That human wholeness that we have, we need to be able to create workplaces where they can bring it. But I think that if there's that attitude of people used to just muscle through this, and if they were having a tough day, they'd do it anyway. And instead to be able to say, hey, this person has knowledge of really what they need, and they're willing to ask for it, so that we can all move forward in the best possible way. And that should be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. I want to pivot a little bit right here. Recently, I read an article, and they were talking about, the idea of the future proofing, let's just say the business. And it wasn't directly about credit unions, but it was talking about looking forward and defining the business critical roles of the organization. I guess, what does that mean to you? And from the people side, because you deal with a lot of people, how do we know if we have the right people in place to help us move forward into the future?
So when we're talking about business critical roles, my favorite pivot point that we can look at, I think, as an industry is if you are a credit union and you recognize that technology is critically important to the way you're serving your members, but you have not evaluated the roles you have in your organization since, 2005, so 15, 20 years, you haven't really changed things. You haven't kept up with how things are today. So we talk often about 2007 was the advent of the iPhone. And of course, that really changed the way people interact with banking, because everything's on your phone then. And if you have the same job descriptions from 2005 as you do today, you don't have somebody who's really looking at the right way to do digital delivery. And of course, there have been many other changes since then. And so that concept of these business critical roles, that making sure they're ready for the future, is being able to actually stop and say, not like, do we have a VP of IT? Because we've always had a VP of IT. And in fact, we really need something different. Maybe we need a VP of cybersecurity and a VP of digital delivery, and they maybe aren't even in the same department anymore, versus being able to just say, we've always done it that way. The second part of your question was, how do we know if we have the right people in those business critical roles?
Absolutely.
So with that, I mean, that's a little bit tougher, I think. And so the first step is defining what those business critical roles are. Second step is evaluating that talent you have today to see if you've continued to develop them in the way that they would need to be developed to keep up with that. One of the saddest things I hear in credit unions sometimes is, 20 years ago, we were a $300 million credit union, and today we're a $2 billion credit union. And our people just haven't kept up with us on our growth. And that's so disappointing to me, because there is this part of me that's like, well, whose fault is that then? Why haven't they been trained and developed and brought up alongside as the credit union has changed its future and its focus and prepared to meet consumers where they are? Why haven't we taken that same internal look and helped to prepare our employees to also meet the business where it needs to be in the future and going forward with that?
So what tips, I guess, would you have when you're looking at a development plan? Let's take a scenario. You're sitting down, maybe you're facilitating a strategic planning session. The credit union is looking at the future. They want to make sure that they can stay relevant. Your advice, let's just say, you got to bring your people along too. What should that credit union CEO be thinking about as they're looking forward when it comes to developing their internal colleagues as well?
The first thing that's probably really important is once those business critical roles are defined, once the organization knows who it wants to be and where it needs to go in order to be relevant, it has to identify what those competencies are that people need to have in that organization in order to be successful. And some of those competencies may be general leadership competencies. You have to have emotional intelligence to be successful in our organization because of the way we treat people, for example. Or they could be more technical competencies as well. So in this specific role as a chief people officer, you must have a competency of being able to recruit diverse candidate pools, for example, or this competency related to technology, you must have an ability to evaluate risk, for example. And then being able to say, are these competencies what we have historically hired and trained for? And if not, how do we identify where the employees are today with their competencies, where we need to be in the future with those competencies, and then how to put a development plan in place that covers that delta. So how do we close the gap between the employees and the competencies we've developed to this point versus what we really need for the future to get there?
So let's flip that around a little bit. You're the CEO of the credit union or the organization, and you have to make sure you're staying relevant, as well. And your skills, maybe you have 5, 10, 15 years left in the career. Any tips, I guess, on how to make sure that we are staying ahead of the curve as well?
I think that the best thing CEOs could do, we hear a lot, that adage, it's lonely at the top. It becomes a popular adage because of the truth to it. And so we recognize that if a CEO is just in their own organization, they will feel lonely. And being lonely isn't just a psychological state in this case. It's also, if you're insular and only focused on your own organization, you only know what's happening inside. I don't think it makes it very easy to future-proof, to know what's happening and how to keep up and how to go around with that. So I think the best thing a CEO can do is to make sure they're really taking that broader look at what's happening, and they're building really strong networks with others who are in similar positions to them, and that they can do that idea sharing, that networking, that learning from other CEOs, and likely learning from outside of their own industry too. So if you're a financial services CEO, as most of your listeners might be, are they taking the time to look and see what's happening in other industries? Like, what's going on with the area of higher education right now? Because whatever's happening in higher education is turning out that next level of talent. And certainly the CEOs of other businesses should have that knowledge about what's really emerging, what's really trending in that area. And I think that's true of many other industries too, that by CEOs making sure they're making the connections, they're getting to know what's happening outside of their world and they're broadening their horizons, it helps them to be able to position their organizations with some different creative ideas that are more relevant to what is happening in the future.
So let's take a look outside the organization as well when we're recruiting new talent. Over the past few years, what's changed? You mentioned early on the idea that people kind of have a better understanding of the whole picture that they want in life, right? But what's changed over the past few years? And when we're looking for that employee or the new team member, the new person to add to our, senior leadership team, are there certain traits that we should be looking for that rise up to you when we're looking for the person that can help us move into the future?
So I'm going to answer that question two ways. From the employee perspective. So what's changing in recruiting as far as what employees are looking for or demanding? So with employees, we see, I just saw this statistic a couple of days ago that indicated that pre-pandemic, 11% of positions were filled with relocation. So 1 out of 10 jobs, you could expect somebody, a little more than 1 out of 10 jobs, you could expect somebody to move from outside the area for that job. And today now it's closer to 1%.
Oh, wow.
So employees are saying, I'm not moving. Like, if you want me badly enough to do this job, I will do it remotely. And that expectation of remote work, anecdotally, I had absolutely seen it in the recruiting we were doing, but to see those hard numbers on it was really eye-opening to me. And so that's such an interesting place to recognize that employees are still holding some power in that ability to say, I'm not relocating for this job. And then in general, I think with that desire to have hey, I'm not going to relocate, what we're seeing with that is a high level of expectation for flexibility with work arrangements, whether that's the work time or that's the workplace. And so can the organization be prepared to employ a remote workforce and still get what it wants out of its employees, out of its team, out of its culture? As far as what the organizations are looking for, I think a big shift we've seen is if historically we would look at a resume and say, boy, that person's held 5 jobs in the last 15 years, maybe they're a job hopper, is that actually we're seeing a bit of a shift. And as long as the employees can demonstrate a high propensity for learning and learning agility, sometimes those different jobs, those steps from organization to organization can be seen as a positive, because what it's showing is a level of adaptability, flexibility, an enthusiasm for growth and for forward progress, assuming those jobs are indicative of forward progress. And so what used to be a bit of a negative, having those different jobs, those different employers on your resume, is actually now creating a situation where employees who come in maybe with 15 or 20 years at the same employer and maybe not a lot of steps in that are actually being perceived as people who are more comfortable with the status quo, less interested in growth, and maybe are not the high performers you want. So some of the more human skills that can be demonstrated through things like connection, leadership, emotional intelligence, learning agility, instead of just the how many years were you there and what are the core accomplishments that you had in that time.
I'd kind of like to go down that a little bit more, but like from the employee side, if maybe they don't feel they're getting the development they need in their organization, what can employees do to, ensure that they're staying up to speed and that they're staying relevant in the future of their organization as well, or that next opportunity?
I think if employees are feeling like they're not getting that investment in their development with their current organization, for some, that is the reason why they leave and go find another organization. If you do have an individual who is interested in and able to own their development and they're willing to take charge of that or take control of that, some of the best development things that individuals can do, and they don't necessarily need the permission of their organization or a budget from their organization, but looking for opportunities to lead in other community organizations. So, for example, I often counsel people who want to be a first-time CEO that it's very likely that the board of directors is going to be looking for someone who has experience working with a board of directors. And a lot of times I'll have employee or candidates will say, well, how can I get experience working with a board if I'm not a CEO yet? And the answer might come with the go out and join a board, a nonprofit board in your community where you actually are the board member. And that will give you some experience in that board CEO relationship as well. It's not working for a board, but it certainly ties to that. So that's one development area. I think that a beautiful thing about the way the world has changed is that we have so much access to knowledge and learning tools as well. So, there's always the traditional conferences and education and online webinars, but there's also so much more that a person could go out and find through like a masterclass or listening to podcasts and moving that way too on development.
Absolutely. Okay. The CEO sitting here listening today and they're like, oh, crap. We're not doing a good enough job of this yet. What advice would you give that person who's listening, who's like the first steps to make sure that they're moving in the right direction?
The first step is likely to assess the current state of your talent. So look at what you say as an organization you're moving toward, and then look at what you do as an organization to bring your people along with that. And I think that an evaluation of that, honest introspection of that, will be very telling for an organization. So if the organization is saying, we need to be absolutely frictionless in the experiences we're giving our members, we need to be offering great digital technology, and then you look internally at your training processes, your onboarding processes, sometimes there's a gap there. Sometimes we're not offering seamless, great digital education to our employees in the first place, let alone education about how to deliver that. And if we notice that we are internally not acting in the way we say we want to be, that might be the first step to start taking, is to make sure we're really communicating throughout the whole organization. We say this is where we're going to, and here's what we're going to do to bring every person who's in this organization today along with and aligned with that direction we're going.
So you work with a lot of leadership teams at credit unions from coast to coast. So many sky miles. What will a successful leadership team look like as we move forward, in your opinion?
I think a successful leadership team is going to be one that can both manage really well in their functional area, but manage really well across the organization too. And so by that, across the organization, that's where this idea of really developing team competencies or synergies, where the sum is greater than the individual parts that we're pulling together from that. And what that means is creating kind of that first team mentality at the leadership level, where we don't have we feel like we share accountability for shared common goals and are very much aligned around a vision. So sometimes I see organizations say, okay, here's our strategic plan. These are our 5 business goals. And here's the executive champion of each of these goals. And we can kind of sit there and say, okay, great. The chief retail officer and the chief marketing officer, they're going to work on membership growth. And the chief lending officer is going to work on the loan goals. But really what we need is a shared unified understanding of how do we be a little bit fluid and a little bit flexible in prioritizing the organizational goal and then leveraging the resources to support and move forward to that, regardless of what we feel like our individual goals are. So I think historically, we've done a lot of breaking down and saying, how do we divide these goals up so everybody knows how they contribute to an individual goal? And I think what we're going to see as we continue to move forward is more shared cooperative leadership around the same goals as the organization moves forward as one organism, really.
The siloing, it sounds like, right? Like of the organization. Is there anything else that just maybe we've done in the past that you just think won't cut it anymore as we're moving forward?
I read something from Principles by Ray Dalio the other day, and it was kind of a light bulb moment for me because I thought, wow, we really, I think, as organizations historically have probably really adhered to this idea. And so what it was saying is this concept that training is when we want to develop people's skills and help them evolve. But rehabilitation would instead be described as kind of this attempt to create significant changes in people's values or abilities, and recognizing that, values and abilities are not so easy to change. They take a long time, and maybe a lot of special expertise in doing that, perhaps in therapy. And so in that case, like, rehabilitation is really not what an organization should do. And if there's this idea that we're looking at our employees and expecting them to be much better in the near future than they have been in the past, it's probably a mistake. But what I think I've seen organizations do with that is it's this, you can either change out the people. So if that's the case and you have these boxes and they're filled with people who need rehabilitation, you can change out the people, or you can change the design of the organization and leverage things differently, put people in different boxes. And I think what some organizations have done historically, if they haven't been willing to terminate or they haven't felt like it's right, they've changed the design, but they've changed it to accommodate people's weaknesses instead of looking at it and saying, well, how do we, is this person needing training or rehab? If they need training, let's invest in it and happen. If they need rehabilitation, that's probably not likely. Is there a different box on this org chart where they will fit well because of their strengths? And if not, we cannot compromise and create an organization that compensates around their weaknesses with that. So when we talk about this concept of future proofing and looking toward the future, I think that organizations are going to have to stop that effort to compromise organizational design in order to make things work around different people, and instead be really, really clear on, can we develop this person up? And if this person is resistant to where we're going, then what can we do to stay really true and relentlessly focused on the organization we are trying to become, and help this person maybe find a place perhaps outside of our organization where they can continue to use their strengths to the best possible ability.
That's really interesting. Before we move on, was there anything that you were hoping I was going to ask when it came to future proofing that I didn't, that you want to make sure that we get out there?
I think the most important thing that I really wanted to just emphasize was that idea of making sure that when we are talking about future proofing with this, I'm really coming at this future proofing concept from the human side of it. And it definitely, without question, future proofing our organizations, there are going to be other structural, systemic, technological things that have to happen too. But when we are looking at the future proofing from the workplace perspective and the human side of that, what we're really talking about is, how do you create that environment where your humans are able to thrive? And then my recommendation on the future proofing is, get that environment set where your humans can thrive, and then give them the tools, put those in kind of later. But really, I think instead of saying, well, let's make sure we have the technology in place and then go from there, if we can get the people side of it right, we can get the people operations side of it right, those tools that they'll use in order to advance, those can be added later.
One more question on this before we go, and it's a question that I've asked you on previous shows, but I think it fits so well into this conversation, is like, for that college graduate today, or, maybe the one that's coming down the road. We both have, you have a niece, I have a nephew that are getting close to graduation. What does a career in credit unions look like a few years from now? Does it change?
I hope that what it looks like is this, and this may be the optimist in me going back to that idea of, I believe if credit unions are successful in achieving their mission, we will eradicate global poverty. And I think that a future career in credit unions could look increasingly more mission oriented, maybe even than it has been historically. And of course, I believe that credit union careers are highly mission oriented. I use the Harrison assessment to measure suitability of CEO candidates. And a lot of my CEO candidates have one of their top 5 traits as this cause-motivated trait, which is to do work that's beneficial to society. And it's not necessarily true of CEOs in other industries
right.
that come out of that. But my hope is that with increasing awareness around these elements like emotional intelligence in the workplace, that what it does is it frees up the people who are passionate about the work that credit unions do to continue to find their place in credit unions and continue to advance the mission-oriented side of our work.
Absolutely. So, okay, let's have a little fun. We're going to wrap this thing up here with the rapid fire questions. And I know you've answered a bunch of them, so I've tried to bring some new ones in. But when was the last time you were amazed, personally or professionally?
So I was thinking about this, knowing you were going to ask me that question. And obviously, you know that Crosby got a puppy recently. And so we have this new little family member, and it's only been about a month. I'm absolutely amazed by how much it feels like he's just part of our family. And so I'm amazed by how quickly I absolutely fell in love with him. But I'm also, you were there when we got him at the Humane Society, and he was this little shaking pup who was like terrified of everything. And now he's not scared of anything, and he's pretty sure that he is the master of this household too. And so I'm amazed by that transition, I think.
Otis is an amazing addition. That is true. So now that many folks out there are back in the office and on the road again, what are you doing like to make sure you're still creating that space for a balanced life? You mentioned employees are looking for that. Any hacks that Jill has?
So for me, it comes down to exercise. And what I have realized in maybe the last 6 weeks or so is it's not just about making sure I make time to do fitness, but that I actually need to really pay attention to the type of exercise I'm craving. So I've gone through phases where it's been yoga. I've gone through phases where it's been more like high impact weight training. And right now I'm noticing that I'm in a phase where it isn't long distance running. And like any of it is important. Getting your body moving is super important. But I think for me, there's a mental health connection that comes depending on the type I'm choosing. And I know that when I'm finding that I'm sort of physically craving the long distance running, mentally I'm craving a little extra space and time to think as well. And so that's one of my kind of big hacks, is not just to exercise, but actually to pay attention to what kind of exercise it is that I'm feeling called to do.
I would get a lot more time and space. You're just so fast. So, anyways, I think from past episode, everybody loves your book recommendations when you're on the show. So what are you currently reading? Anything that you've been recommending over the past few months since you've been on the show?
So I am currently reading, and I'm liking it so much that I think I may actually even try to start some book club is not the right term, but maybe try to start some specific coaching tied to this. And the name of the book is Bridging Differences for Better Mentoring. It's by Lisa Fain and Lois Zachary. And the concept of it is that when we end up in mentoring relationships with people who are, who we have different characteristics from. So men and women, or people from different races or ethnicities or different backgrounds, that the mentoring may need to be approached in a way that is more thoughtful, is more intentional, is more planful. And what I love about the book is that we know so often that if we're sort of left to naturally choose our mentor-mentee relationships, we often are attracted to people who remind us of ourselves. And that we recognize there's a lot more value that comes when we are mentoring sort of across different lines. So what I love is that it's essentially like a guide and workbook to creating success in those mentoring relationships.
Sounds like a good one to check out. So, and we'll all be on the lookout for your book club. So I know you said that's not what it's called, but
maybe I'll call it that. We've named it now today.
Jill's Book Club.
It shall happen.
the next Oprah and Reese. There you go.
I was going to say one step closer to Oprah.
That's right. I can't wait to sit in the front row. What does success look like or mean to you when you hear that word, and how do you personally measure it?
So for me these days, it's more of a feeling. And right now it's really kind of this feeling of having a level of energy. And I think the reason why I'm recognizing that, or I'm kind of coming to that reality, is that there are times in life, and I'm sure these are times that, CEOs know this, people building new businesses know this, parents know this, where there are times in life where you may feel like you're doing all of the things and you're trying to get it all done, but you're so freaking exhausted, you just don't enjoy it that much. And so for me right now, what I'm recognizing is that the success is coming with this like continued persistent state of like energy. And so having a level of energy, enthusiasm, like the capacity to enjoy the work that I've put in and the outcomes I'm getting from that. So, having the energy to enjoy some time with Crosby, having the energy to celebrate when I have new work coming in and get the opportunity to do more than that feels successful right now.
I feel like you're getting away easy on the rapid fire questions because I've asked you them all. So I'm going to have to put a little more work into this and think up some new ones for you for the next time you're on the show. But last question, any final thoughts you'd like to share today of our listeners, or do you have an ask of everybody out there?
I foreshadowed this a bit maybe earlier, but I'll emphasize it again anyway. I'm really optimistic about where we are, not just as a credit union industry, but really where we are as from a workplace perspective. I'm optimistic about the future of work in our country. And I think that we as employers have this opportunity today to work with people who are so much more whole than we used to let people be. And I think that wholeness is excuse the sort of grandiose thinking here, but I think that wholeness is going to be what saves the world. And, this idea that like whole, healthy people don't start wars. They don't commit hate crimes. Right. Like they're kind, they're cooperative, they look for solutions. And I think if we can create this environment where we're already lucky to have this sort of increased level of consciousness, as I said before, where people have a higher level of awareness. And I think if we can continue to create those environments that cultivate that and give people that chance to be, whole humans, that we're going to continue to see some positive outcomes from that. So my final thought is that I am optimistic. And I guess my ask is, look for those opportunities to reframe. If you're those people in the airport that are sitting there griping about how nobody wants to come to work today, is there a way to reframe that and look toward the good that is coming from this higher level of self-awareness, this higher level of consciousness? And we're recording this in May. It's Mental Health Awareness Month. And is that additional focus that we have today on mental health awareness going to be what it is that lets us move toward a place of greater harmony in the world?
Well, there you go. That is the perfect way to wrap up this episode. Thank you so much again for being on the show with me. I always appreciate it. And I love our conversations. We will link to everything in the show notes that Jill talked about today, including her contact information, so that you can get a hold of her or follow her or connect with her or whatever it happens to be. Thank you so much for being here again. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. I love being on your show.
You're my favorite. A few things before we go. Make sure to check out CUIs and be sure to learn more about TalentNEXT in the show notes or at CUIs.org. They are a longtime partner of CUInsight.com and the podcast, and I'm grateful for their support to allow me to have this much fun doing what I do. Also, check out the links to everything Jill and her team at Humanidei have going on. They will all be in the show notes as well. You can find her other episodes of her on the podcast, as well as the Humanidei team's writing in the community of CUInsight.com. Please also subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast player. We're on them all. And Finally, the books mentioned on the show. A quick Google of the CUInsight Experience podcast book list, and your next read is on its way from Amazon. Last but certainly not least, I want to thank all of you for listening. Y'all rock, and I appreciate all you do. Be well, friends.